It's really an interesting question where anthropology is headed, anthropology at large, but I think in the Canadian context, particularly I guess in settler state contexts, in liberal democratic systems, we're seeing preferential hiring of Indigenous people for work on Indigenous topics. And that's an important and necessary corrective for all the reasons that we're aware of. It's raised questions for my non-Indigenous students. What is the role for a non-Indigenous person working on Indigenous issues? And even very practically, what's the career path? Because if your aspiration is to work in an academic department, these days universities are targeting positions that have anything to do with Indigenous topics. They're really, that's what they're using to try to recruit into young Indigenous scholars. So I think this is requiring us to think, I would say decolonially, in across a much broader canvas than we have been so far. You know, I think one part of an approach here is a point that Michael Ash and others have made, that we are all treaty people. When you have a treaty, there are parties, there are responsibilities from both sides, and I think that resonates with the sort of relational ontology of my Cree friends and colleagues who see relationships as reciprocal. Cree society has had historically a very kind of inclusive idea of what it is to be human, and have in fact assimilated a lot of, over a 300-year period, have assimilated a lot of Europeans into Cree society. But there is today a certain polarization, in part because of, or rigidity perhaps, I would be better to say than polarization, a rigidity of categories of humanity that have to do with legal and political arrangements that the state has come to in its negotiations with Indigenous people. And what's the role of non-Indigenous scholars on these issues? I think there is a role. I think that Indigenous peoples themselves have typically become so multicultural that they're able maybe to be better translators of their own traditions than non-Indigenous folks. So one reason that we might have been involved in the game in the past is gone. But I think at the level of responsibility for that relationship, we have to have scholars who are also non-Indigenous, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. to think through their respective roles and responsibilities. What role do I have? I'm a settler's child. I grew up in a place that had relatively recently been taken for Euro-Canadian settlement. And I understand the injustice in that, and I also understand that I have no other place to go and no other place to love in the same way. So what are my responsibilities intellectually, ethically? I think people from those positions have to be part of the conversation together with Indigenous partners. And I'm not sure how that's going to work out within the framework of academe. I'm quite concerned that the discourse of indigenizing the academy is the wrong discourse. Decolonizing the academy, or better, decolonizing society, is the much better goal and standard. And how do we use universities to do that? We have to reinvent social institutions writ large, including the university. The university continues to be part of the problem. We see that factually, our colleagues in most disciplines are not terribly interested in, certainly not professionally interested in justice for Indigenous people. It's something they read about in the newspaper, and they may have certain sympathies for, but they don't understand it as part of their professional role within the academy. And in that instance, the people who end up talking with Indigenous people in the academy are people who are sympathetic to Indigenous questions. And there's a lot of heat sometimes in those conversations, which is sometimes not that constructive, because the people who really need to be having these conversations are not interested in having the conversations. So that's a problem, I think, with academe. But there's a more fundamental problem, and that is the whole notion of higher education. We are coming to see Indigenous knowledge as a value that has a lot of currency across now several disciplines. But as an institution, or Indigenous knowledge as part of a territorial institutional matrix with its own institutional depth, can you accommodate that from the ivory tower? Does this notion of elite university education or higher education have anything to do with what's happening in Inuit or in any number of Indigenous communities and territories? I think, and I think De Sousa Santos's work on, the end of cognitive empire is very important in this regard. We have to think ourselves into arenas of knowledge co-creation that have much less to do with the elite academy, and a lot more to do with conversations on terrain. going to town hall meetings in Montérégie and understanding issues of toxic waste dumping and downriver contamination affecting Kanien'kehá:ka and settler residents alike. And we have to be figuring out what are the forms of knowledge and of knowledge co-creation that can build effective political alliance, interpeoples alliance. Those are the dynamics that I think are required, and it's clearly broadly interdisciplinary, because you've got to have experts in water quality, you have to have experts in, agricultural technology, you've got to have anthropologists, lawyers, economists. I do think that working collectively and working across many knowledge disciplines. And of course, it's not just interdisciplinary, it's interepistemic in the most genuine sense. One of the disconcerting things about the uptake by many disciplines of traditional ecological knowledge is how shallow that uptake is and how detached it is from the real political contexts in which it matters. Or the real environmental stewardship contexts in which it matters. In traditional ecological knowledge has been appropriated as a certain kind of currency, often by people who've got very little relationship, really, to indigenous ecological knowledge. So I do, and I think this is a fairly natural position for an anthropologist anyway, but I do think that we need to move knowledge co-creation and interpeoples alliance to the venues that matter. And the venues that matter are the ones where there is something precious that remains intact in terms of biocultural diversity, in terms of socio-ecological integrity. If we cannot preserve what has not already been ruined and give a fighting chance for some places that have been ruined to be resurgent, then I think we're lost on the scale of humanity at large.